Okay, so we have three incredible people here today. I will introduce each of them in turn, and we will with Seth, but I'll also introduce Jess and Joanna before they speak. And so Seth Klein, many of you will be familiar with Seth's work from the Center for Policy Alternatives. And let me just tell you a little bit more about Seth here. So Seth is one of Canada's leading policy analysts who served for 22 years as the founding director of the BC office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, CCPA. This is Canada's foremost social justice think tank. Seth, thank you for your service there. He's now a freelance policy consultant, speaker, researcher, and of course, author of this fantastic new book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, which we will learn more about today. Under Seth's leadership, the CCPA grew to over 6,000 supporters and published research reports on topics such as taxes, poverty and inequality, labor policy, the future of BC's resource sectors, climate change, of course, the climate crisis, healthcare, public education, international trade agreements, the BC economy, and so much more. Seth is also the founder and served for 8 years as the co-chair of BC Poverty Reduction Coalition and 10 years on the advisory Metro Vancouver Living Wage for Families campaign. He was also the co-creator of the methodology for calculating the living family wage. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of the living wage. So he was the co-creator of the methodology for this, which is now used in about 36 Canadian communities. He's currently an adjunct professor with SFU's Urban Studies program and remains a research associate with the CCPA's BC office. Seth, it's so good to have you here. Over to you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you see me?
Yes, indeed, we can.
My stuff is all working. So thanks to Royal Roads and all of you with the leadership program for this invitation, and to Jess and Joanna. I'm absolutely thrilled and honored to be doing this with both of you. I'm joining you with gratitude from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As I argue in my book, the recognition and assertion of Indigenous rights and title is central to winning this existential fight of our lives. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Jess's stories of Indigenous leadership in the climate mobilization. So I've been asked to open with some thoughts about leadership, drawing upon my book, and there's so much to share. I'm glad that we're gonna have lots of time for discussion. The book is in many respects a book about leadership, and it's an invitation to leaders today to think about the leaders who saw us through past existential moments, and to really ask themselves, who do you want to be today? And you know, it strikes me that when it comes to the climate crisis and the threat it poses, as I watch different leaders at different levels, and I'm sure many of you get a gut sense of this as well, you know, there's some leaders who get it and some who don't. I think with many of us, a person hits a tipping point of learning and facing what the science is telling us and the threat, and you either kind of feel that sense of alarm in your bones or you don't. And often we can tell. So my book calls on us to adopt an entirely new and different approach to the climate crisis than the one that we've pursued to date. I've endeavored to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis that we face, but it's also my belief that those of you who read it will find it an unusually hopeful book. Its original twist is that, as the title suggests, the book is structured entirely around lessons from the Second World War. And I should say there's no small irony in me coming to this place. And like many of you, I'm sure, I wrestle with this wartime analogy. My own political activism started as a teenager in the 80s in the peace and disarmament movement. And moreover, I'm the child of Vietnam War resistors. That is how I happen to be Canadian. My parents refused to participate in an immoral war. But I am now strongly of the view that climate breakdown requires a new mindset to mobilize all of society and galvanize our politics and to fundamentally remake our economy and our institutions. And here's why. Hoping you can call up the graph with the slide that I sent. Here's why we need a new approach. And that's because what we have been doing in response to the climate crisis thus far simply isn't working. The chart has Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back over the last 20 years, and what you basically see is a flat line. Incidentally, if I showed you the same slide for British Columbia, it basically looks the same, meaning our emissions are no longer climbing, but neither are they in decline. Despite decades of calls to action and promises and commitments, our emissions are not on a path to stave off a horrific future for our children and future generations. We have run out the clock with distracting debates about incremental changes, but where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we have accomplished precious little. And so here we are at the 11th hour, confronting this harrowing gap between what the science says we have to do and what our politics, at least our mainstream politics, seems prepared to entertain. And that's my opening premise today and in the book is that's what we're facing. And I didn't start off planning to write a war story as I ended up doing. The book project began as an exploration of what do we do to align our politics and economy in Canada with what the science says we urgently need to do. And the book is that, and it seeks to challenge what I call the new climate denialism, meaning leaders who say they get it, but not really. And it also explores how that new climate denialism operates in combination with its sister affliction, rights and what I would call rights entitled denialism. I'd originally planned in the book to include only a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War because I'd long been intrigued by the war as an example of rapid economic transformation. But as I delved into that work, I began to see more and more parallels between our wartime experience and the current crisis, and ultimately decided to structure the entire book around those lessons because I see in the history of our wartime experience this helpful and indeed hopeful reminder that we have done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across society to confront an existential threat, and in doing so, we have retooled our entire economy twice, in fact, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime, all in the space of 6 years. So the book explores what wartime scale climate mobilization could actually mean and look like. And each chapter jumps back and forth in time between stories of what Canada did during the war, mainly on the home front, and what we now face. And in these comparisons, it answers questions like, how has public opinion rallied to support mobilization in the war? How can it be galvanized again? What was the role of government, of the news media, of arts and culture? How is this social solidarity secured across class and race and gender? How can we do that again? How is national unity established across Canada's many provinces with their varying interests? And can we do that again as we move off fossil fuels? How did we marshal all of our resources to produce what was needed? How do we do that again? How do we pay for the transformation then? Can we mobilize the finances again? What supports were offered to returning soldiers, and is there a model there for just transition for fossil fuel workers today? What was the role of Indigenous people in the war? What is it in today's transformation? What was the role of youth and social movements then and now? Importantly, too, what are the war's cautionary tales, the warnings of things that brought us shame, the internment, the squashing of civil rights, the poisoning of Indigenous lands, perhaps most apt to the current crisis, the response to refugees. So those are the things that we don't want to repeat. We're looking for our leaders to model what they should from that time, but also to be different. And running through it all is what sort of political leadership do we require to see us through challenges like this? So and the book shares some remarkable stories about leadership and this stunning ability to pivot with remarkable speed and to take risks and move with amazing audacity in the face of an existential threat. And it's interesting to note that at the start of the war, unlike what I think many of us assume, the public wasn't all there. Everyone wasn't ready to rally. And, you know, when I was doing my book research, I interviewed many political leaders, all leaders who I think get the climate crisis, but whose governments aren't doing yet what we need to do. And when I pressed people on that point, all of their answers in one form or another were a variant of, well, you have to meet the public where they're at, and the public isn't there yet. I did some polling, which actually found that that's not true. In many respects, the public is ahead of our politics when it comes to the climate emergency. But I also note that's not what we most remember of some key leaders in the Second World War. They didn't meet the public where they were at. They took the public where they needed to go. Since releasing my book in September, I've frequently been asked in interviews, how do you know when a government gets the emergency? And you can ask the same sort of questions about any large institution. By the way, I've lost track of time. If maybe one of the hosts can give me a little time check. Tell me how many minutes.
You're good to go for another 4 minutes or so, Seth.
Great. 4 minutes and 4 markers. So in answer to that question, I've developed these 4 markers of when you know that a government, or really any large institution, has shifted into emergency mode. And the 4 markers are these. You spend what it takes to win. You create new economic institutions to get the job done. You shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures with clear near-term dates. And number 4, you tell the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicate a sense of urgency about what's now necessary to combat it. And it's striking that during the Second World War, the Canadian government did all of those things. And likewise, I would say in response to the pandemic, the Trudeau government passes all 4 of those markers. But with respect to the climate emergency, thus far at least, none of our federal or provincial governments hit any of those markers. Let me say a little bit more about each of them. Like when you think about spending what it takes to win, we've spent a lot this year in response to the pandemic, and Canada's debt to GDP ratio has gone from about 30 to 50%. At the end of the Second World War, it was more than double that. And when C.D. Howe, who was the minister who oversaw Canada's wartime production, was pressed about government spending, he famously replied, "If we lose the war, nothing will matter." And they did remarkable things to do that, including new progressive forms of taxation. The kind of profiteering that we've seen in this pandemic was illegal in the Second World War because we had an excess profits tax that tackled that. But federal spending on the climate emergency and green infrastructure pales in comparison to what we did in the war and the pandemic. The Trudeau and Horgan governments, they're not spending a little less than they should. They're spending less by a massive order of magnitude. Creating new economic institutions to get the job done. The second marker, during the Second World War, from a base of almost nothing, the speed and scale of what we accomplished was incredible. Just to give you one example, here in British Columbia, where we seem unable to build a single BC ferry anymore, from a base of almost nothing, we produced over 300 ships. And remarkably, under C.D. Howe's leadership, the Canadian government created 28 crown corporations during the war in order to expedite that necessary production. He was seized with the task. I describe him as an engineer in a hurry, and anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do what was needed, he created another crown corporation. He undertook detailed economic planning to ensure wartime production was prioritized. Similarly, we've seen this kind of audacity in the pandemic with the quick creation of new programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy with the speed that few of us would have predicted. But in response to the climate emergency, we've seen nothing of the sort. Trudeau government, unlike C.D. Howe, has created 2 new crown corporations during its time in office. The Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is a vehicle for privatizing infrastructure that's so far accomplished very little. And you know what the second one is? It's the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation that makes us all proud owners of a 60-year-old oil pipeline. The third marker is we shift from voluntary to incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. So when I showed you that chart earlier about how little progress we've made, why is that? It's because to date, almost all the climate policies we've seen are voluntary. We encourage change, we incentivize change, we offer rebates, we send price signals. What we decidedly have not done is require change. If we're going to meet our GHG targets, and those set out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we need to set clear near-term dates by which certain things are required. So for example, we would say, you won't be able to buy a new fossil fuel vehicle after 2025. We would say no new buildings will be able to use natural gas for heating as of next year. We would ban advertising by fossil fuel vehicles. That's how we'd make clear this is serious. And the fourth marker is you rally the public at every turn. As I mentioned earlier, it took leadership to mobilize the public in the war. In frequency and in tone, in words and in action, the climate mobilization needs to look and sound and feel like an emergency. And the leaders that we most remember from the Second World War were outstanding communicators who walked this careful line. They were forthright about the gravity of the crisis and yet still managed to impart hope. And their messages were amplified by the news media who knew which side of history they wanted to be on, and by arts and culture and entertainment sector who rallied the public. We've seen the same approach in the pandemic. And again, none of this consistency and coherence is present in respect to the climate emergency. When our governments don't act as if the situation is an emergency, or worse, when they send contradictory messages by approving new fossil fuel infrastructure like pipelines, they're effectively communicating to the public that it's not an emergency. And so if our leaders believe we face an emergency, they need to act and speak like it's a damn emergency, to name it and speak continually about it and rally us at every turn. That's what you do in a crisis. I hope I'll end with this. I'm hoping in the discussion, one of the things I've been wrestling with, in the book and with the war and the pandemic, what's the alchemy of these emergency moments? The combination of events and leadership that changes the zeitgeist of the population to get the emergency. And I'm struck by the fact that these things can happen quickly, right? If you asked Canadians in 1938, does this gang in the Mackenzie King cabinet have what it takes to completely transform Canadian society and the economy? I'm pretty sure most Canadians would have said no. And if you'd asked me a year ago, if there were people at Finance Canada and the Bank of Canada, with the creativity and audacity to quickly create these programs we've seen in the pandemic, I'm pretty sure I pretty cynically would have said, no, I don't think there's anyone at home who thinks that way. And I would have been wrong. So you never know. The book also, there's a bit of a Where's Waldo thing in the book of spotting the people and the leaders who abandoned, who broke the rules and defied orders because it had to be done in an emergency. I won't go into them now, but I think we have such people again today, in particular Indigenous land defenders, and we'll hear more of that, I'm sure. These are the people that posterity will remember in times of an emergency. And I'm hoping we can also talk a little bit about, because this is hosted by Royal Roads, what's the role of schools and the post-secondary sector in an emergency? Because it was extraordinary during the war. You had high school tech schools that were running 3 shifts, including an overnight shift, to train people up to do what was necessary in the war. The size of post-secondary the sector in Canada doubled after the war as a way of reintegrating the soldiers who had returned. Are our post-secondary institutions today truly pivoting to this moment? I'm not sure, but maybe we can talk about that too. But these next 10 years, they're going to make or break us in the future for our kids. This is it. We're at that crossroads moment again. And we all have to decide what kind of people and what kind of leaders we want to be. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Seth, thank you so much for your powerful, inspiring words. I'll applaud you with my actual hands, and I can see that on the reaction tab, people are, that the applause symbol is starting up as well, and lots of great dialogue is coming up in the chat also as you were speaking. So thank you ever so much for your wise words. And at this point, we won't take direct questions for each speaker. We're going to move through each of the speakers. So at this point, it's my honor to introduce the next speaker, who's Jess Husti Suwagilau. is a Hutsiat change maker who is supporting her community of Bella Bella, BC, to bring back food security, sovereignty, and self-reliance in the face of damage inflicted by colonization. Part of her journey is to seek out promising young people who are contending with the climate crisis in evidence-based and impactful ways and engage them in conversations about hope. Jess is the executive director of Project Society, a Healtsiak charitable nonprofit located in Bella Bella in the heart of the Great Bear Rainforest. Established in 1999, QQS has a holistic mandate to support Healtsiak youth, culture, and environment. And in an article I was reading about Jess, when she was asked, "What advice do you have for younger people?" she replied, "We are the descendants of survivors. It's important for us to root ourselves in ancestral strength, and I'm confident in the vision of our young ones. Our future successes are in their hearts and hands, and they're dreaming an incredible future into being." And this part also really touched and inspired me when I read it. When the interviewer asked Jess about any advice she had for older people, she said, "Trust the leadership of youth. Practice saying, 'Sounds wonderful. How can I help?'" Jess, over to you, and let me know if you would like me to run the PowerPoint slides as well.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you, Catherine. And yeah, I appreciate the introduction. I'm so grateful to be here. I'm grateful to Seth and Joanna for doing this with me. Seth, that was some really incredible food for thought for me. I don't often spend a lot of time thinking about what this looks like in a context that is not an Indigenous community context. And I think when I think about the path to climate leadership for our communities, we are experiencing emergency fatigue, whether it's clean drinking water, environmental racism, land theft, birth alerts, medical racism, suicide rates, the theft of our children in the foster care system. Like, we are surrounded by emergencies all the time. And so as I share a little bit about what climate leadership looks like here, it might be a bit of a different message, but I really appreciate that there's lots of alignment as well with many of the good words you were sharing. So as Catherine mentioned, my name is Shiwagilauch. My borrowed name is Jess Housty. I am a citizen of the Heiltsuk Nation, and I live in my unceded ancestral homelands in Bella Bella, British Columbia. I am a descendant of the East State people through my late grandfather and the Hoyt people through my grandmother. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about a charitable nonprofit in our community. Catherine, if you could go to the next slide.
Sorry, just 1 second.
No worries.
Okay.
So Cox Project Society is a Heiltsiak charitable nonprofit. We were founded in 1999 at the behest of our chiefs and matriarchs of the day, who were observing in our community that as we were experiencing the first generations in which children were not being forcibly removed to residential schools, that we had a lot of hard work to do to grapple with that trauma and to learn how to be families again, how to function as a community again. We were beginning to take back control of local institutions like our community school, our health center, but there was so much deep pain after generations of fractured families and generations of people who had been regulated off our territory and away from their culture, who had lived through the potlatch ban and been unable to safely or legally connect with culture and ceremony. And the net result of all of those impacts in the community was really deep pain that was leading to high suicide rates, lots of social dysfunction. And through the wisdom of our elders of the day, they felt very strongly that the best way for our community and our families to heal was by reconnecting to our culture and being back out on our territory. And so the early roots of Cox as an organization are really part of that deep response to the community of saying, we are not people who want to be in pain. We want to be people who are in our power, and our power comes from our culture, it comes from our land. And so reflected across all of our programs is this really deep belief that if we can get our youth and families and community members outside, on the land, on the water, living their cultural identity, feeling safe and strong and secure in it, that we will be supporting the kind of leadership and growth and healing that our community really deserves. If you could go to the next slide, please. I want to acknowledge that I do not do this work alone. I have recently stepped into the role of executive director at our organization, and there is an incredible team of people who are the real champions of what we do. In particular, you can see in this slide here, Clea Schooner and Vanita Stegman, who are the heart and soul of our office and the only reason I actually get anything done. We have a core staff of about 15 people who work with us year round, and seasonally we bring on about 25 additional staff members who run land-based programs for youth. The vast majority of our staff are HELSIC people, often who come to us very early in their careers, often in their teens, often growing out of our program participant roles into leadership roles in our programs as part of a really deep commitment to long-term investment in people that we have. And the important thing for us is that people can see reflected in our programs that leadership comes from within our community. We have what we need to survive and to thrive. And I'm incredibly proud of the team that we have at CUX that helps to make some of this magic happen. If you can go to the next slide, please. I just want to share a little bit about our governance and our approach. And you can see on this slide 3 incredible HELSIC women who are part of our board of directors. Our entire board of directors is made up actually of incredible women who represent different partners in the community. So they come from different agencies like Catholic Child and Family Services, HELSIC Tribal Council, Social Development. We have chiefs and matriarchs, representatives from our health center, because the work that we do is not just non-competitive, it needs to be deeply collaborative if we're going to make change. We want to be breaking down silos and making sure that our community is holding all of us accountable to delivering the kind of really deep, holistic wraparound services that they deserve. You know, it's a bit of a struggle for me sometimes when I'm interacting with folks in the nonprofit sector who are not working in an Indigenous community context, because it feels like the way things operate a lot of times is that, you know, an organization, they define their mandate and then they try to find ways to bring people to their mandate. Our mandate is just to show up and listen and step up to the needs and the solutions that our communities identified. And so when you look across the whole spectrum of programs that we run, in a lot of ways, it seems like there isn't much of a common thread between them, but the common thread is always that either another organization or a community member has come to us and said, we think this is the thing that we need. And we like to be the people who show up and say, yeah, we're going to make that happen. If you could go to the next slide, please. So our homelands, for those of you who are not familiar, we're on the outer central coast of British Columbia. Our territory stretches from the mainland out through outer coastal islands to open ocean. People like to talk about our territory as being remote. I guess it's geographically remote. It is the center of my universe. And, you know, our territories are often on the front lines, you know, whether it's, you know, battling old growth deforestation, fish farms, the Great Bear Rainforest agreements, fighting with DFO over the commercial herring kill fishery, the Nathan E. Stewart oil spill. There have been so many flashpoints where our territory has been the center of attention. It's been the front line that people are paying attention to. But at the end of the day, when those causes aren't trending anymore and everybody else packs up to leave, we're the people who are still here. We've always been here and we're always going to be here. And so finding ways to feel deeply secure in our role as stewards of our territory, regardless of who's standing beside us, I think has been really critical work that we've tried to undertake, recognizing that solidarity is often really fleeting and that we need to find ways to build deeper relationships so that people are living the front line the way that we do, I guess. You know, I feel really deeply that we owe it to our ancestors and to our homelands to be here in this place in a good way, and that we owe it to our youth to love them into leadership. And that is really the root of CUX's work. If you could go to the next slide, please. Bala Bala, for those of you who aren't familiar, you know, this is This is where we are. We don't quite have this much snow right now, but it is a beautiful sunny day. My office is overlooking the main dock. I can see seagulls and ducks in the harbor and boats going by. We are surrounded by incredible nature, and as a community of about 1,500 people with gosh, I think around 250 school-age youth right now. It is just so, it's not possible to not feel connected to the territory that surrounds you. It is right there. It's all around you, and it's so beautiful. You can go to the next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about the programs that we run. We run some programs in Bella Bella that are very focused primarily on literacy and education. We run a community library. We run a lot of collaborative programs with other organizations in Bella Bella. And we do a lot of work related to food systems resiliency and bringing back ancestral medicines. So, we run community gardens in Bella Bella. We're presently supporting more than 1/3 of households in Bella Bella to grow some portion of their own produce every year. And we are finding ways to support people to access more ancestral foods and increase the proportion of ancestral foods in their diet. And if you go to the next slide, where we really shine is with our land-based programs. We run a variety of programs, including the Quay River Youth Camp, which has been part of our roster of programs since day one. The Quay Sanctuary, which is adjacent to our camp, and it's a family healing center. And the SEAS program supporting emerging Aboriginal stewards, which is a sort of science enrichment program that gives youth both Indigenous science and Western science tools to learn about their territory. And when you think about our land-based programs, what we're really trying to accomplish there is reoccupying our homelands. Right now, all of the Muslim people who live in our territory are in one community in Bella Bella. Pre-contact, we had more than 50 villages spread across our territory, which is 35,000 square kilometers. We don't know exactly how many Hellsec people there were pre-contact. I've heard estimates of anywhere from 10 to 40,000, but we know that at the lowest point in our census data, after waves of colonization and disease, there were 197 Hellsec people left. And so for us to be taking that deep breath in and then letting that deep breath out, it's a really beautiful thing to be able to create opportunities for youth and families and community members to exhale their way onto the territory, be out on the land again, and find ways to be out there in a good way. And what I believe, and what I think our whole team at Cux really deeply believes, is that if we can make our territory a place where our community members feel safe and connected, and if we can make their cultural identity something that makes them feel really strong, the result is going to be generations of people who have an unbreakable relationship to the place they come from and to the people they come from. And my long game, if I have one, is that people protect what they love. I want them to love themselves, I want them to love one another, and I want them to love the place that we came from, that our ancestors have taken care of, because I want them to take care of it for my kids and their kids. If you could go to the next slide, please. We know this works. One of the hard things often about doing this kind of deep community work is that it can be hard to track your success metrics, but we've been doing it for 22 years, and we're at the place now where we're starting to see intergenerational change. And not through Cux alone, of course, because we have so many incredible partners in this community, but we come from a really activated community. We come from a community that has demonstrated time and again, through many struggles and crises and between the struggles and crises, that they are ready to practice unconditional love for our culture, for our homeland, and to root their resilience in that love. Every single thing that colonialism has tried to take away from us is still here, and we're not going to let it go. And the proof for me is being able to see second generation program participants coming, like the children of people who were the children in our programs when we got started, are now the ones who are stepping onto that boat, stepping out onto the land, showing up for our programs and growing into leadership roles in them. And that's such an incredible thing for me. If you go to the next slide, I want to share just one little anecdote that might make me cry for a warning. So far, I've never told this without crying, so just, it's okay, buckle up. We try to root our work in really strong Celtic values of respect and reciprocity and accountability to our community. And we try to root it in our culture. You can see in these pictures, this is Kukuaus Heiksach, the first big house to be raised in our community since time before memory. We opened it in October of 2019. Sadly, did not get to use it for very long before the pandemic hit, but all of us are very much looking forward to gathering again in the kind of proximity that you can see in that second photo, to partake in ceremony together. And we spent generations gearing up for the moment of opening our own big house. We spent years working really hard to actually realize this vision. And then when it was done, we spent 5 days celebrating. And I remember a moment where I was sitting in the back and trying to take in like this incredible, overwhelming spectacle. And I looked around and realized that the people who were dancing, the people who were singing at the drum log, who were speaking into the microphone, speaking our language, sharing stories, sharing songs and history, people who were attending the dancers, serving the food, filling just about every function in that big house. When I looked around, they were all kids who had grown up in our programs. They were kids that I remember being 5, 6, 7, 8, coming out camping with us for the first time, coming out on the land with us for the first time. And to be able to see in such a beautiful, powerful moment, how strong and confident they were doing that work they were doing. And to know that we had just the immense, overwhelming privilege of playing one small part in making them ready for that. That was, one of those rare moments where you know the work you're doing matters, you know that you're succeeding. And I hope that we can keep doing that for many generations to come. If you can go to the next slide. Just as a closing thought, I think a lot about what it is that we want to carry forward in our work, what it is that we're working toward. And, I think as a community, we realize very clearly capitalism is not going to save us. Governments are not going to save us. The real question is what's going to sustain us. And it's not anything that comes from outside of here. What's going to sustain us is unapologetic love for ourselves as Celtic people who are survivors and descendants of survivors. It's unapologetic love for one another as, members of a community. Unapologetic love for our territory that somehow, in spite of all of the assaults of colonialism, is still here and strong and beautiful and powerful and alive. And I think that what's going to sustain us too is being able to invite other people, like all of you, into that love too. Some of you may be familiar with the late Haisa Elder Cecil Paul, who had an analogy about a magic canoe, and I think it's an apt one to share here. And his analogy was that, this work that we have to do it's a magic canoe, and there's room for absolutely all of us to be in it, paddling together. And I think about that a lot, both when I'm literally physically out paddling in a canoe with our kids, but also as I'm thinking about how we can engage all of the people who need to be engaged in order for us here to succeed and survive and thrive. You might very fairly ask what all of this has to do with climate leadership and the climate emergency, which is the point of this panel. The answer is either that it has nothing to do with the climate or it has everything to do with the climate. But, the climate emergency is genocide. Like every other assault on our people, it is something that fractures our relationships with each other and with everything we depend on. We are, as a community, extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And in many ways, on my darkest days, it feels like we have so small an ability to contend with it. But what I recognize really deeply is that the climate emergency, this is our front line now. And although people have walked away from our front line for just about every other cause, every other moment that we've seen, people cannot walk away from this one, not now. People who are loved and people who feel connected are also people who feel able to be bold. And I think my takeaway is that what we need now is boldness. And if I can love people into boldness and love people into leadership, That is the kind of connectedness that I strive for in my work. And I think, at least on this very small scale of our community, our territory, we know that love works. We know that love is powerful. We can feel it coming from our ancestors and from our land. And I hope that you can feel it too. And I invite you into that really important work. Kaya Sika.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Jess, for your powerful words. Oh, I need to just take my own deep breath in here, Jess, after hearing your story. Love people into leadership and love people into boldness. Those are words I will not forget. Thank you. Thank you. We can see also the chat is lighting up with a number of different responses as well. As I just sort of compose myself here, I'd like to also introduce our third panelist, Joanna Kerr. So just give me one moment to pull up Joanna's bio here. Maybe everyone's taking a deep breath as we transition here. Okay, so Joanna Kerr is the president and CEO of Make Way, a leading national charity that builds partnerships and solutions to help nature and communities thrive together. Joanna led Greenpeace Canada as executive director, working to stop climate change and protect precious biodiversity while supporting Indigenous rights. She served as the first female chief executive of Action Aid International, working in 50 countries with the most marginalized communities to tackle inequality. She also led the Association for Women's Rights in Development, transforming it into one of the most significant global feminist conveners and influencers on funding for gender equality. Joanna has held senior positions with Oxfam Canada, where she spearheaded its Women in Climate campaign, and the North-South Institute, where she was researching, writing, and influencing international policy and processes for women's rights and empowerment as a senior researcher throughout the 1990s. Joanna holds a BA from the University of Toronto and a Master's in Gender and Development from the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex in the UK. Joanna, welcome. Thank you for being here, and over to you.
Thanks, Catherine. How do you think I feel having to follow on from the amazing Toasty and Seth Klein? And I know we all really want to get into a discussion of all these amazing, inspiring perspectives. And I'm hoping that I can do something to connect these two amazing presentations. But first, let me thank Royal Roads and thank the Indigenous people of the Ojibwe and Huron-Wendat territory where I'm sitting. It's a very snowy, beautiful day here, and so I want to thank the Indigenous people who have stewarded this land and who are now teaching us so much about the way forward. And I also want to thank Seth for writing such a critical book. And it was on my side table. And when I came into this presentation, it forced me to read it. And I highly, highly, highly recommend it. And I will be pushing it to many people. So if you haven't had a chance to read Seth's book, please do so, because it is extremely hopeful. And so where to start? I mean, really, solving this climate emergency is literally the most wicked problem that humanity has ever faced. And if we are to be leaders, we have to see this not as a technical problem. A technical problem is, where 1 + 1 = 2, but it is truly an adaptive challenge. And I think, as Jess has so beautifully reminded us, it's going to require every single one of us in all of our diversities to get into that canoe. And it's going to require us to shift our beliefs, our actions, our cultures. And actually, that's going to mean overcoming a huge number of conflicts. You know, in their brilliant article on the work of leadership, Hayfitz and Laurie have said, a leader has to have the emotional capacity to tolerate uncertainty, frustration, and pain. So conflict is going to be inevitable. So how do we actually use it as a source of creativity? I think the key here is that righteousness and judgment are not helpful, but curiosity and discernment are. So I actually spent a lot of time in all of my leadership roles to encourage colleagues and partners to find constructive and collaborative ways of grappling with highly divisive issues. And that actually starts with knowing that people are motivated from very different things and orient from very different places to solve problems. I often turn to integral theory. I've become accredited as an integral coach, recognizing that people problem solve from very different places, either from systems or from actions or from relationships or from meaning making. That's just one perspective. But I find over and over and over again, inside organizations, people are often in conflict because they don't see how other people are coming to solve problems from where they, from where they orient. So I guess maybe one of the boldest acts of leadership for me is really the patience and resilience to keep people connected through conflict and actively working to hear one another, to move one another. Because we are going to need all forms of problem solving on our team or in our canoe. And because of the immense complexity that tackling climate emergency will involve as an adaptive challenge, it means that we actually have to recognize that there are creative tensions. It's not that one's going to be fully right, or it's either or thinking. We're always managing these creative tensions, i.e. staying humble and listening or taking bold risks. Slow, deep work, or sometimes we have to do fast and responsive, where there's central coordination or purely delegated authority and letting the margins lead. And as leaders, one needs to get out of the weeds and get up on that hill and have that perspective, because if you want to change the system, you actually have to be able to see it. And across Turtle Island, across our society, we have to understand that people are coming at climate from very different value systems. So while many of us on this call might see this as a question of ethics, of justice, there are many in our society that actually are motivated by aspirational success. And so they might be much more excited by the technological opportunism of the green economy. Or there are many in our society that are really coming at this from a sense of needing to feel secure in clean water or a livable world for my kids. Again, we need to see and connect people across all of our values. So I think, like Jess, for me, bold leadership looks like living and working interconnectedness every single damn day. So I meditate to build the muscles, to observe my thoughts and emotions. When am I contracting? When am I feeling defensive? How can I really remain curious and understand when someone is upset? So how can I step in to see how to build the space for people to listen and learn from one another, especially as a settler in this country? And how do I create that psychological safety in teams, in those spaces, in our movements, so that people can actually have those conversations to take risks? I used to lead Greenpeace, and a quick story, we were setting up to start this massive campaign to save the Arctic. And so many of our European colleagues were seeing it just from a place to fight the oil companies and protect the polar bears that were dying. But no, the Arctic is inhabited by people, by water and land defenders, as we've just so beautifully heard. So this is essentially a battle for Indigenous rights and food sovereignty. You might think that obvious now, but back in 2014, when I learned just how much Greenpeace was hated by the Inuit because of what the role that the organization had played back in the 70s and 80s on ending the commercial trade in seal products, I had no idea how we were going to confront this, huge animosity, given the devastating impacts that Greenpeace had had on the economies in the North. So we had to step in and step forward and apologize. And it also meant we had to educate people in the South and around the world that seals, polar bears, narwhals are harvested sustainably as a critical source of food, an essential part of Inuit culture. But man, were we hated on all sides. There is a story, and it's a beautiful one, and I don't have time to tell it. But it's one of a partnership between a community known as Clyde River working with Greenpeace, where together we took on the Canadian government and the oil companies to stop Arctic drilling. And we took that battle all the way up to the Supreme Court, and we won. And we brought the public along through storytelling, global media attention, help of a few celebrities, and we worked across issues, nations, cultures, and perspectives. So as leaders, we need to keep connecting the dots. As a feminist, climate is a fundamental women's rights issue. I first truly recognized the climate emergency by talking to women living in poor communities, all of whom were dependent upon rainfall, now so erratic, to feed their families. This is an issue of economic well-being. I won't go into it because read Seth's book and how he beautifully connects the dots between the climate emergency and finally tackling inequality for well-being, economic well-being for all, so that all human beings can flourish. It's a mental health issue. We move beyond retail therapy and obscene consumerism, which is actually not making us happy, to things that do, like connecting to nature and each other, and we will reduce our ecological grief. And the most important connection of all, well, Jess said it so beautifully. We are all part of nature and hold a stake in its future. We have to go back to remembering that we are actually animals and are all part of a living system. It's our responsibility, not as natural resource extractors or managers, but to take on our role as humans, to dream, to plan, to create new realities, and to work with nature, not against it. So what's the role of larger organizations in mobilizing for this climate emergency? Well, yeah, we have to hold our governments to have a very coherent approach, connect the dots, build the policy and government apparatus that Seth so beautifully outlines in his book, and hold our governments to Indigenous rights and governance. At Make Way, we are heavily investing in Indigenous protected conservation areas as central to nature-based climate solutions. We have to expose the new climate denialism for what it is and rally that public at every opportunity. We have to really amplify the leadership perspectives and voices of Indigenous leaders, of young people, of even tar sand workers who want out, of women, of doctors and nurses who know what's at stake, of artists. We also have to invest far more in culture and behavior change and the research behind that. It's just a tiny, tiny proportion of the research that goes into climate change. And we really have to create the conditions for people to, as Seth says, break the rules, to get beyond the cynicism, apathy, this paralyzing fear, and to find the solutions for themselves. For this wicked problem will only be solved with our collective intelligence. And I just think that communications on climate change has been way too masculine and way too wonky. Price on carbon, that's not a winning solution. Talking about electrification of the grid or 350 parts per million, no, that's not it. So even before I heard what Jess was going to say, this is about communicating love. And this is a love story. Right now, this is a heartbreaking love story. For the climate crisis is the hundreds of thousands of koala bears that burned in the fires last year. It's the monarch butterflies that are no longer migrating. It's the shrinking rivers that are heating the essential Pacific salmon from coming back. It's the kids and moms and dads dying on boats, escaping climate-induced conflicts. It's the decades-long battle to save old growth and intact forests from turning into toilet paper. It's the profound ecological grief and mental illness experienced by farmers, by Indigenous water and land keepers, or the kids who see no future on a burning planet. It's also the Albertan oil sand worker who doesn't know how he'll feed his loved ones now that KXL has been canceled. It's the families grieving over the meat packers who died of COVID because of a food system that prioritizes profit and burgers over human and animal welfare. So to end, bold leadership will also mean we find the ways to defend and sustain what and who we love. We are truly in this together. Thank you.
Oh boy, Joanna, this is a moving panel indeed. Thank you so much. You can see the chat lighting up with thank yous and hearts and applause icons, the different ways that we're communicating in Zoom. My heart is deeply, deeply touched by the words all three of you have shared. I'm so very grateful to you for taking the time and for everyone in the audience for being here today. I'd like to suggest that we hear the words that that Royal Roads President Philip Steenkamp really quickly, and a whole team mobilized to get this video organized. So I'd like to suggest that we honor the work that he did, and I'd like to ask my colleague Selena or Karina to play that video now. While we all take a few deep breaths and take in the words that all three of you have shared. Thank you so much. And over to my colleague now to play the video from Philip. And this is in some ways a direct response to what Seth said at the beginning, and some of you were saying in the chat about, what is the role of education and higher education in particular? What role do we play and how can we support? All right, here we go.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion today. Although I am unable to join you live, I know my fellow panelists are well placed to carry on this important dialogue and to challenge our organizations to be bold in addressing the climate emergency. I'd like to share with you my answers to 5 questions posed to the panel. Those questions are, so what are we doing in this space? How do we build a culture of commitment to sustainability? What guides us? What is the role of other organizations, and how do our programs at Royal Roads support this work? So in terms of bold actions that we've taken in this space, when I joined Royal Roads 2 years ago, climate action was, and it continues to be, a top priority. The climate emergency, as we know, has become an existential threat like nothing any of us has ever encountered. And I truly believe that higher education is strongly positioned to take bold and transformative action. Royal Roads particularly is an inspiring place for this work, and anyone who's been lucky enough to visit our campus knows and feels that deeply. I personally draw inspiration from this place and its people. The deep cultural significance of the Kosopson and Kwanghan ancestors and families, the richness of the forests, creeks, rivers, and oceans, and the faculty, staff, and students who embody our values of courage, creativity, and caring. In many ways, the real work has just begun, and I'm excited about our path ahead. But some of the actions I've taken include the development of a new strategic plan, a new vision for the university over the next 25 years, with the vision statement, inspiring people with the courage to transform the world. And it has a set of goals and actions that provide a focus on the climate crisis, as well as the interconnected social, economic, and political challenges, and in particular on advancing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I've also moved, with the support of my colleagues, to divest from fossil fuels, mining, and pipelines in our investments. and that divestment was completed as of March 5th, 2020. We as well have created a climate action task force, which is a cross-disciplinary group of faculty, staff, and students, which was established following a campus-wide conversation on climate action. And this task force is charged with delivering a new climate action plan this year, which will focus on not only the operations of the institution, but our programs and our engagement with communities beyond our walls as well. As well, we have provided significant support to academic initiatives, program and research as well. We've launched, for instance, a Masters in Climate Action Leadership program. We are paving the way as well for a legacy of Canada research chairs focusing on things like advancing the UN Sustainable Development Goals, reimagining capitalism, and also on climate change, biodiversity, and sustainability. Last spring as well, we launched the Cascade Institute, which is led by Dr. Thomas Homer Dixon, who is one of the country's leading complex system scientists. And this institute researches and addresses complex global systems and identifies effective interventions that could rapidly shift the course towards fair and sustainable prosperity. The issue of how you build a kind of internal culture to maintain that commitment to sustainability is an interesting one. And at Royal Roads, we are known for our commitment to sustainability, innovation, and leadership. And that reputation itself acts as a positive feedback loop where our institutional strengths have also become values. And there are a few areas of focus that I believe will create the necessary organizational culture. For us, climate change is defined as a must. It isn't an optional thing. We really have to focus on climate action. And a climate lens is needed on every single decision, program, and policy we make. We need to get serious, we need to get specific, and we need to do this fast. Just as we have a whole of university response to COVID-19, we need as well every department and portfolio area working with a climate lens. We also need to increase our capacity as an institution through education, awareness, and agency raising. Once you really appreciate the scale and the imminence of the problem we are facing, it becomes clear that we need to do much more than take individual action. We need to work with fellow institutions, post-secondary institutions, but also with all kinds of organizations across society to advance this agenda. These are complex, multifaceted problems which require collaboration. Leadership support as well is needed and is present every step of the way. I'm very excited about the work, for instance, that the task force is doing, but implementation I know will require courage, dedicated investments by the university, and a willingness to adapt and adjust. And as leaders, we need to model that commitment. We also need to listen and to connect. We need to listen to voices that aren't typically in the room. This is part of our broader equity, diversity, and inclusion agenda, whether it's because of barriers that have been in place because of race, gender, economic status, or other barriers, visible or invisible. We need to approach climate solutions with ways of thinking that challenge worldviews and experiences driving the crisis. And that sort of diversity of viewpoints, opinions, and experiences will help us solve some of these wicked problems. Finally, we also need to celebrate. We need to remind ourselves that what we do, in fact, is and what we have done, in fact, has led to a lot of progress. And we need to celebrate that progress. Our collective hope, agency, and caring for this world will keep us going. And I do think there's a danger of just becoming disillusioned and passive in the face of the immensity of these challenges. So hope is really important, and optimism is important. In terms of the values that guide our work here, our university values are creativity, caring, and courage. And I can tell you that they personally guide me in my thinking and in my actions. We care deeply, and I care deeply about the environment and about future generations. We need to be incredibly creative as we tackle some of these challenges. And we will need courage. Courage because we've got some big decisions to make, some hard decisions to make. And we're not only dealing with climate mitigation, we are also dealing with climate adaptation. Climate change is upon us right now, and we need courage to kind of tackle what is in front of us. In terms of the larger role of all organizations in mobilizing for the climate emergency, in a way, it's very simple. I would just say, the basic point that we can't stand by idly watching, seemingly half aware, as this climate crisis develops into a global catastrophe. If every organization mobilized with the same urgency and focus that we have over the last 10 months to tackle the pandemic, that would be incredible. And really, we can't move fast enough. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, Bank of England, and now in his role at the UN with a particular brief on climate, said it well. He said, the biggest risk is that we talk and talk and talk about this for another 5 or 10 years, and then we have to make even more drastic adjustments to stabilize the climate. So in addition to action within each of our organizations, we must step back and take stock of what's out there. What is our ability to act as influencers, partners, role models, or advocates? How do we activate those conversations and relationships to affect change? And how can we make that change happen in a way that protects the most vulnerable? All of this requires new models of collaborative leadership and adaptive capacity building. But when it comes down to it, our common rallying point is a love for this planet. And for this, I think we can harness high levels of focus, courage, and resilience as individuals, as organizations, and as a society. So how do Royal Roads programs support this work? Royal Roads is a purpose-driven university with sustainability and change-making at its core. As a higher education institution, change-making leadership is one thing that really defines us. Within and across disciplines, we focus on enabling our students to lead and make positive change in a complex world. And this is built into our very foundations and expressed in our learning, teaching, and research model. And climate action and sustainability is included in curricula and research projects throughout the university. So this really concludes my response to the panel questions. Thank you all for listening, and I wish you the very best for a stimulating and productive discussion on this hugely important topic. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you to Philip, and applause to Philip for on such short notice when he was called away to another meeting with government. So here we are, folks. We're nearing 11 o'clock, and we know that some of you likely have questions for the panelists. We'd love to hear the panelists in terms of their responses to one another as they themselves were listening to one another. We also have a few. So I would like to suggest that the panelists now take an opportunity to just briefly summarize what they would like to share as we come to an end here. And we'll try to wrap up what the panelists say by 11 o'clock as we had scheduled. And for those of you who have a bit of time to stay on, we have an exciting giveaway of Seth's book. And I was thinking, Jess, you mentioned The Magic Canoe as well. I think we'll do a giveaway for that book also, and so that we can get that information out into the community as well. So for those of you who would like to stay on a few minutes after 11, we'll be doing that and sharing some other ways to stay connected. And for the time being, let me stop speaking and hand it back to you, Seth, for any words you'd like to share at this point.
Oh boy. I'll be brief. First of all, I just loved the other presentations. it sounds like Royal Roads is doing great stuff, and Jess and Joanna, those were very moving. And I'm struck that right at the beginning of your talk, Jess, you talked about emergency fatigue, which is real, of course, and in particular, you know, how devastating the actual reality of that is on so many fronts in Indigenous communities. And similarly, you know, often as I've talked about the ideas in my book, people often say, oh, but look at COVID, like people are already experiencing emergency fatigue. And that's true. But I guess what I would say about that, the kinds of emergencies Jess was talking about are devastating. The emergency fatigue that we experience in the pandemic is because the things that we are told to do in response to the pandemic are anathema to all of our social instincts. Isolate. Here's the good news in terms of what's different about the climate emergency. The answer to the climate emergency is precisely the opposite. It's asking us to go out and do something grand together. That's good news. Even though we live at a moment of great ambiguity about whether or not we will succeed at this in time. You know, that's the reality. But I like to point out that you know, just as a level of what true society-wide mobilization starts to look at, like in World War II, Canada was a population of about 11 million people, less than a third the size we are today. And over 1 million of those people enlisted. I mean, it's a mind-boggling figure, actually. 70% of them were under the age of 21. And what they didn't know, we kind of lose sight of this because we know how the story ended. What they didn't know is if they would win. And they did what they had to do anyway. And that's the moment we're in now.
Powerful words and inspiring, Seth. Thank you so much. Jess, any final thoughts?
Thank you. Yes, I will try to keep them really brief, which is just that I'm grateful to know and feel really deeply that in doing this work, which is often very daunting, if nothing else, I never feel alone in it. And I know that we all come to this work by different paths, but the important thing to me is that we are doing it together, and I'm appreciative of that. So thank you.
Thank you, Jess. Joanna?
Yeah, I won't take any more time because I had the benefit of speaking after the amazing words of Seth and Jess. But yeah, certainly encouraged to hear university leadership speak with such compassion and such clarity about the role ahead. So very interested to find out how your leadership program could build the kind of bold leadership that we need, the ways and the different ways in which we've spoken of this morning. So back to you, Catherine. And again, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and I'll invite Kathy Bishop in just a couple moments, not quite yet, to say a bit more about that exact question that you're talking about, you know, the kind of programming. But now let's turn over to Karina. Many of you I know have been watching her draw, illustrate, graphically record what we've been talking about today. Karina, would you like to walk us through what you've got here?
Yes, of course. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. So, I mean, I am just completely buzzing from such a wonderful session. And I always like to say as a starting point is that what you can't see are my many, many notes and scribbles that I'll be incorporating after the session has closed. So I've just tried to at least highlight for you some really high level themes and moments from the discussion. And then after the session, I go away and kind of make a more fulsome visual. And so what I am really hearing from all of the speakers today is that really the bold action that organizations and communities and individuals need to take is to go back to themselves and to their communities. And that's where they will create those spaces to mobilize, to educate, to listen to youth voices, and to think about how they can be thoughtful about the past, what learnings there are, what takeaways there are from the past, from history, as a way to make changes or have ideas that will mobilize us and give us the energy that we so dearly need right now to keep moving forward on this emergency. And just the note that we're experiencing emergency fatigue just hit so deep that we are really receiving it from all sides. And so again, going back to community and those around us to get that strength from each other and know that we can't do this alone. We need each other. So thank you so much for allowing me to visually capture this session. Thank you.
Beautiful images and words. Thank you so much to you, and what a treat to be able to see and to know that more is coming. And we will be sending this this image out. This graphic will come out to all of you who are on the call now and everyone who registered. Plus, we'll post it up on our School of Leadership Studies blog, so you'll have access to the final completed version of this visual as well. So at this point, I would like to do one final round of applause, a collective round of applause to the panel before we move into some concluding points from our school. But thank you from my heart. Thank you ever so much. You can see the chat room lighting up with all of the notes of inspiration, people from India, from the UK, from all across Canada, sharing with their children, sharing with one another, and the recording will be available to share as well. Thank you to 3 inspiring panelists and also to Philip for his video. Wow, what an incredible morning. So at this point, I'm going to just share briefly this slide as my colleague Kathy comes on the line. And Kathy, would you be willing to speak? You know, this panel really, there were 2 purposes. Purpose. One is, of course, to talk about mobilizing for the climate emergency and draw from the examples that each of the panelists gave us. And it's about, of course, the other focus is the leadership required in community, in organizations, the culture change that many people spoke about today. So Kathy, would you like to say a few words about how the program that you're leading can help to address these issues?
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Catherine. And just want to say, wow, you know, it was so inspiring to hear from Seth and Jess and Joanna and Philip. And then to have all of you on this webinar, because there's really a deep commitment to bold organizations mobilizing for the climate emergency. But also there's a real key thread, as Catherine identified, around leadership. And so, as she said, I'm Kathy Bishop, and I'm the program head and one of the instructors in our new MA in Executive Leadership. And so I'm just here to tell you a little bit more about it. But in answer to your question, Catherine, I mean, ultimately, people are turning to organizations to make a difference. And in fact, they're expecting it. In 2019, the Edelman Foundation found that 71% of employees hold that organizational leaders must lead on societal issues and employee needs. And this is at a record high. And for organizational leaders, this really is a call for action. And so really, how does an organizational leader lead boldly in today's evolving, complex landscape, where a title or a rank is not a guarantee that your teams are going to trust you or work with you to reach the goals of your organization? And so Edelman found that people grant their trust based on two distinct attributes: competence, or the ability of the leader to deliver, and also on ethical behavior, or doing the right thing and working to improve society. And so people are often promoted to mid-level to senior level leadership positions because they're effective in their technical or their professional roles. But when you take on new leadership roles, they're often unprepared for what awaits them, or how to navigate that human side of organizational life. Or, as Jess noted, the power of the team of people who help make the magic happen. So it's clear that different capabilities are needed for senior leaders in organizations, and that involves purpose, mission, values in action, and engaging people. Yet we have this mythology in the Western world, what Whitnor deemed as genius without learning. And that's the false notion that genius does not need study, it doesn't need exposure to work or craftsmanship, but it does. And so this gets back to, Joanna's ask and interest, and also Seth's ask in terms of what's the role of higher education in climate emergency, but what is the role of higher education in leadership development? While stepping into these learning and leadership needs, the MA Executive Leadership is specially designed for this type of leadership to, one, foster sustainable organizational change through attention to values and culture, because the whole world right now is getting up in arms around the lack of values, and people are talking about values and transformation. And values of organizations need to be modeled by leaders whose personal values align with them. It's also, two, to strengthen both leadership character and capabilities by acquiring new mindsets and skill sets to think differently, act boldly, not get blown off the path, and be forces for good. And three, work on organization culture, structure, and innovation in relationship to both what's going on in the organization, but also outside and those external realities to improve society. And so while there's many leadership courses out there that will teach you what to do as a leader, this program at its very core is about how to be a leader. As Joanna noted, lots of people come from different value systems, and we need different types of problem solving. And so the executive leadership specialization is not about creating cookie cutter leaders. One size does not fit all. We need leaders to step up as who they are with people and in the context that they find themselves in, to develop character and capabilities. So it's structured as a 2-year, 36 blended program. It has online courses and 2 one-week residencies. It also offers 9 units of electives, and it culminates in a capstone of an organizational leadership project that's engaged. And the graduate certificate and values-based certificate, leadership certificate, serves as the first term, and it also stands as its own certificate. So, in summarization, this is a one-of-a-kind executive leadership specialization program that develops and nurtures values-based, people-focused leaders who inspire collaboration and innovation in organization. It's distinctive in that it fosters transformative leadership learning, and it integrates theory and practice. It's based on designing practical organizational challenges, both within the classroom and in the workplace projects for mid to senior level leaders. So to find out more, and I'm just going to put it in the chat box, I'll give you sort of our link to our website. And then also, please do feel free to reach out to me as well. I'm always happy to talk more. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Great words and program that you're leading. Really appreciate your work. So at this point, we also want to mention that there is another new program starting in addition to the one Kathy just mentioned that's actually called Climate Action Leadership. And so this is really focused on the climate action piece, whereas Kathy's is focused more on the executive leadership piece. And I'm not seeing my colleague Robin Cox. You can see another graphic recording here by one of Karina's colleagues, because Robin Cox actually was a member of the panel of a previous webinar we did last year, lessons from COVID-19. You know, what can we learn from COVID about mobilizing climate action leadership? And so we're going to send out just a link, or you can access the link to the recording of that webinar on our website. And we're certainly happy to share all of that information. And there's a little bit more. You can see the website here. Information available to you online. And of course, there are many, many different kinds of leadership programs in the School of Leadership Studies. We've got global focused, we've got multi-sectoral, we've got health. There are lots of different program options available for you. We're happy to chat about it at any time. And now those of you, the 50 of you who have stayed on the line, we'd like to do a special book draw at this point. So this we've in one of our webinars before. Sherry, I'd like to ask you to turn your video on for a moment and ask for your support, please, with this. If anyone would like to enter a draw for Seth's book, I'd like to encourage you to find that spot, usually toward the bottom of your screen. If you're on a cell phone, mobile, it might be in a different location, but that place where you can raise your hand. And I'm going to count to 3. I'd like you to click that button to raise your hand. And then once the order of hands has been established, I'm going to ask my colleague Sherry to draw a number out of a hat so that she can, so Robin, just put your hand down. Yep, you're all practicing. Great. So put your hands back down again. And when I count to 3, we're going to all do it together, and that will establish the order, and we'll see who wins the draw. So ready, everyone? 1, 2, 3, raise your hands. Great. Well done. Perfect. Okay. All right, Sherry, now, my friend, can you please draw a number out of the hat?
I can. So I've got them here. Let's see. Drum roll.
Yes, we need a drum roll in the background.
Number 6.
Number 6. Okay, one of my line, could I ask you to help check the participant list and tell me who was the 6th person to raise their hand?
And I see Maria Bremner in that position.
Oh, how perfect is that?
Wonderful.
Maria, wonderful. Okay, Maria, I'm going to ask you to connect with me after the webinar. Send me an email, please, and I think you have my contact information. Send me an email and address and get that out to you. So now for the second draw, everybody put your hands back down again, and we'll do a second draw for Cecil, Paul, and Brianne Penn's book, The Magic Canoe. So put your hands down, lower your hands. I see a few of you still have your hands up, so put your hands back down again. Maria, I'm going to ask that you don't participate in this one. We're sending you Seth's book, but for the next book, ready everyone? 1, 2, 3, go! Raise your hands. Great. Perfect. Okay, Sherry, may I ask you to draw a number again, please?
Going in again. And I have got number 19.
Number 19. Oh, how perfect. 19 people raised their hands. So who's number 19, please?
Number 19 would be Robin Levesque.
Robin, wonderful. Okay, now Robin, I'm just going to ask you if you have time to stay on the line, or maybe one of my colleagues, Selena, could I ask you to send Robin a private message in the chat and make sure that you have his mailing address as well, so that we can get the Magic Canoe out to Robin. And congratulations. Well done, everybody. You can put your hands back down. Thank you for that fun interlude. Thank you, Seth, for writing a fantastic book, and Jess for mentioning the Magic Canoe as well. We have 2 future webinars. One's coming up in 2 weeks' time on February 5th. This one is really taking the global perspective, building global resilience, looking at the role of social purpose organizations in building global resilience. This one is hosted by our Masters of Global Leadership. And then in about a month's time, Management in a Pandemic. Hearing Health Leaders' Voices. This one's on February 19th. Lots of information available online. And this particular one is hosted by our Masters of Arts with a Health Leadership specialization. So many, many ways to stay connected to us. Here's some information about the enrollment advisors, the international admissions, those of you joining from the UK and India and elsewhere in the world. Here's how you contact us at the School of Leadership. Here are our social links. Connect with us, follow us on any of these accounts. And my friends, I think that draws our webinar to a close. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. And again, a huge shout out, a huge thanks to the panelists, not only for being here today, sharing your wisdom, but for the vital work that you're doing in the community in order to help mobilize Canada for the climate emergency. Thank you, everyone. Have a fabulous day. Take care. Bye-bye.